fellow assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins Podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. I want to start this episode off with a question for you all. What is the most rewarding experience for a software developer or software engineer? In other words, what is the most rewarding thing that can happen to a software developer during their career? Now, of course, there's no one singular answer to this question, as we're all different. We all have different things that, drive us forward to progress in our career, things that, give us motivation. So we're all different in that regard. But I wanted to go through in this episode some of what I think are some of the more common ones and kind of explain why some developers might find this to be a rewarding thing and kind of my overall thoughts on it and experiences with them. Because as we've talked about before on the podcast, burnout is a very serious issue when it comes to software engineers and software developers, and if we can figure out ways to mitigate burnout, that is obviously something that we want to do. And in my opinion, one way to mitigate burnout is to, have those kinds of rewarding experiences to kind of, alleviate kind of the normal day-to-day drone that usually goes on when you're just kind of stuck at a keyboard forced to click-clack away like a code monkey till the end of time. Before we get into some of those experiences, let's start off with our trivia question for the week. So aside from version control, what do Team Foundation Server, or TFS, Mercurial, and Git have in common? Now, I understand that is a very broad question, so there might be multiple answers to this question, but I'm looking specifically for just one. But again, that is, aside from being version control software, what do Team Foundation Server, or TFS, Mercurial, and Git have in common? And that is your trivia question for the week. Now, do you guys remember last week when the iPad mini dropped, the new version of the iPad mini, first refresh of the iPad mini in like 2.5 or 3 years, something like that? And I believe I mentioned on the podcast that the jelly scrolling issue had been fixed, or allegedly had been fixed. Well, it turns out, based on some of the initial reviews that I've seen, that it appears, while it's not as noticeable as before, it still exists. So if you were looking to buy an iPad mini, because you figured the jelly scrolling feature was fixed, or not feature, bug or issue was fixed. Well, actually, hold on, let's take a step back. I guess the real question is the jelly scrolling thing actually a bug, or is it indeed a feature? Because, we've talked before on the podcast of, is something really a bug, or is it a feature? Depending on how you want to spin it, you could say that it's a feature. I'm not exactly sure how jelly scrolling would be a feature, or essentially the refresh rate of the screen isn't in sync, so kind of the left moves ever so slightly up faster than the right, or vice versa. Not exactly sure how that would be a feature, but maybe if you wanted to have a simulator that you were like underwater or something, maybe that fulfills your needs and therefore it's a feature. I don't know. But tangent aside, if you were hoping that the jelly scrolling was completely eliminated on this new iPad mini, it appears, at least based on some initial reviews that I've seen, I of course cannot confirm this since I don't have one, but based on the initial reviews I've seen, it appears that it still exists, albeit not as noticeable as before. So my understanding is Apple's using the same LCD panel in the iPad mini as they were on the previous model, but I guess they might have tweaked the firmware a little bit to at least alleviate some of that jelly scrolling. but it does at least appear that it still exists. But with that, let's move into this week's cybersecurity tip. It should be no secret to you all that I am a huge fan of encryption. And we've talked a decent amount in various cybersecurity tips about encryption. One of the more notable ones that we've talked about recently is the fact that encryption is only as good as you let it be. In other words, if you always leave your device unlocked and open, it doesn't matter if you have full disk encryption because anyone can come along and steal your data. But encryption should not just be reserved for your important things like data on your hard drive or SSD, for example, because oftentimes encryption is kind of viewed as mainly for that purpose. It's often kind of reserved for things like sensitive data, like your personally identifiable information. So, of course, things like your birth certificate, social security number, passport, driver's license, all that good stuff. And then things also like financial records, like your tax documents or investment accounts and things like that. But one reason I'd argue for encrypting your less obvious data, like not only focusing on encrypting the important stuff, but your quote unquote less valuable data, things like network traffic log, system monitoring data, and things like that. The reason why I encourage you to encrypt everything is because those otherwise unassuming details are generally what attackers use for reconnaissance purposes, and if you encrypt all that stuff, it makes it that much harder for those attackers or would-be attackers to, get that data that they're looking for because of that additional layer of encryption. Now, this kind of concept in cybersecurity of kind of gathering, this otherwise not all that valuable data is generally referred to as OSINT, or open source intelligence. And generally the idea here is that you gather a bunch of freely available information about someone and compile that to form a much better picture of your target. So one thing that attackers love to do when they're trying to hack someone is specifically for like social engineering attacks. They'll identify their target and then they'll basically browse all of social media to find all the various social media accounts tied to this person, and basically compile and harvest all the information that they can about this person, right? So information like if their birth date is viewable, which hopefully yours isn't public, if you have social media accounts, things like where you went to school, if you have any pets, what the names of your pets are, family members, any information that an attacker can gather to kind of build, a profile on you to kind of understand and get a better sense of, your likes, dislikes, what might get you to engage with a potential social engineering attack, things like that. Because, for example, if they know that you have a dog and your dog is your world, they might try to use something about your dog to exploit you in some kind of social engineering attack. Or if you're not creating good passwords, which you should be, and you have it something like your dog's name or something as your password, if a simple search of your social media, the attacker sees what the name of your dog is and then logs into all of your various accounts and you're done for. So this is kind of in essence of what open source intelligence is, basically gathering otherwise unassuming data in order to compile that into a profile of your target. And kind of another example of this in, from a technology perspective would be if knowing that these on the surface, just individually, knowing that a website is running Apache Linux, not Apache Linux, but it's running the Apache web server on a Linux operating system in AWS and uses JavaScript and SQL, those on the surface, like individually, don't really mean a whole lot. But once you can combine all of those together, you get a much better understanding of what their tech stack is like, and you can devise better ways to exploit some of the potential vulnerabilities in their tech stack and kind of give you a sense of where to proceed further with your investigation. Or, how to, maybe perform a DDoS attack or something like that. Because on the surface, right, all those things individually don't necessarily mean a whole lot. But if you know that they're running a web server using JavaScript and SQL, for instance, maybe you could look for somewhere on their website, is there any way that I could perform an SQL injection? What version of Apache are they running? Is there any known exploits or 0 days in that version of Apache that I can exploit? What version of Linux are they running? Are there any 0 days or other vulnerabilities that can be exploited in that? Are there any open ports on the Linux server that they left open for some reason? They're using AWS, so maybe can I figure out if they're using a scalable architecture, or could I just hound them with traffic and give them a DDoS attack? Things like this are the types of questions that pen testers and threat actors tend to ask themselves when they're gathering this open source intelligence to try to find out how to hack you. So definitely be sure to, while on the surface you might not think something is all that important, if it gets compiled with other things that might not seem like it's that important, can collectively become something that is fairly important. So definitely be sure to be encrypting as much as you can. But of course, if you're encrypting things, also make sure you know how to decrypt them. Don't fall into the trap of encrypting, some data and your key is in, that secure encrypted data, and that's the only copy of it. And then you get locked out for whatever reason, and you don't have your key because it's on the encrypted drive, which happens to have the password on it, but of course it's encrypted, so you can't get to it. So of course you want to make sure that you take the necessary precautions that you don't lose access to your encrypted data, but making sure that you encrypt even the not quote-unquote important stuff is definitely important. So that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. Now, moving right along, let's get into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So I continued working on my Pokemon game, making updates to it, and I got multiple types of items working now. So now I can have a general item type array, but have, different types or different subtypes in that item type array. So currently how I have it set up is I have what I'm calling an item dictionary, which essentially is every item that's in the game and their index in the array is equivalent to their item ID number, so I can just do an instant lookup in the array for the exact item that I want. But of course, not every item is the same, right? Different items have different purposes, different use cases, do different things. So in order to account for that, what I did was this little thing called inheritance. You might have heard of it before. We might have talked about it on the podcast a couple of times. But essentially what I did was I have the parent item class, which basically, of course, as a parent would in object-oriented programming, has all of the main data that every type of item would have. So things like the name of the item, what category the item is in. Is it a generic item? Is it a Pokeball? Is it an HMTM? That kind of a thing. What's the price of it? What's it sell for? All these kinds of things that are pretty much standard across all items. And then of course you have the subclasses to that. So things like potions, your Pokeballs, the various subcategories of an item that are going to have a different use case that's more specific. Now, one issue you run into with this kind of inheritance is how do you properly put them all into an array and also be able to not essentially nuke everything in the process. And what I mean by that is if you just create an array, so in this case items, if we just create an array of items and add a potion item in there, add a Pokeball item in there, and add a repel item in there, if those are each subclasses to the item class, all of their subclass specific information is essentially going to get nuked if you try to retrieve that data back, and you're going to get all kinds of errors and nastiness. Now, the way around this is this beautiful thing called pointers. And of course, I'm specifically here talking about like C and C++. If you're using a different language, things might be different. But in C and C++, you can use the beautiful thing known as pointers to, rather than say this is, because the problem is when you create an array in C and C++, the size of each individual element is based on the type that array is. So in this case, it's the item type. So the size of each element is only going to be the size of an item. The problem is if you have subclasses of the item that have additional data fields, those additional data fields are essentially going to be nuked because they're too big and they won't fit in the allotted space. So, and because it's a statically typed array, you can't like really pull that data out because, like I said, everything is kind of statically typed and yada yada yada. So the way around this is you basically create an array of pointers, or you basically say that each individual element in this array is pointing to an item, and then of course you can make that item be however big you want it to be. It can be a subclass, whatever, and then you can use, in C++, you can do a dynamic cast of that specific index in the array to get it into whatever type it's supposed to be. So pretty cool. So got that working. But also during this process, I realized how horrible I designed my dictionaries to be. And the reason I say this is rather than creating a universal or a single copy of the dictionary, I was creating a new instance of the dictionary every time the header file or the .h file was included. And the reason why I figured this out and how I figured it out was when I was running through my automated test suite and kind of doing some memory leak tests, because I was in this new version of the item dictionary. Of course, rather than just creating the item itself, I was essentially allocating memory for a new type. So there was memory allocations that were going on, so I had to free the memory, and I wasn't freeing all the memory, and I was trying to figure out what the heck was going on because I was calling the free function to free all the memory, yet I was still it was still being reported that I was leaking memory, so I was kind of wondering what the heck was going on. And lo and behold, I was essentially allocating new memory every single time the header file was included, and yeah, it was not good. But I did fix it, so don't worry about that. But now that I actually think back on it, I should have realized this sooner, because even before I noticed some kind of funky behavior like previously when I initially was creating like the Pokemon dictionary, which just has like all the different Pokemon in the game that you can look up. And I noticed there when I was doing some testing with that I was getting a bunch of like extra like function calls. So I would put like some debug print statements in some of the functions, and I was noticing a lot of them getting called initially when the program started up, and I just thought that was weird and could never really track down why that was occurring. But now I know why that was occurring, because those functions are being called every time the new Pokemon was getting created, which was essentially every time the header was getting included. And the other thing I noticed too was the memory allocation like report in like Valgrind, when I was running Valgrind tests, was always seemed to be a lot higher than what should have been allocated, as far, at least, in terms of how big the data structures are. It seemed like there was more memory being allocated and freed than what should have been. Honestly, I didn't really care a whole lot, though, because all of the memory that was allocated was freed. So from my perspective, I didn't have any memory leaks. But I was also using a lot more memory than I actually needed to. The funny thing, too, is when I removed all those extra, so essentially taking out the initialization of the dictionary from the header file and essentially doing an extern to externally define it in a CPP file. Who would have thought that when you're not doing all those initializations and memory allocations, your program speeds up? Who would have thought? And you also use less memory. What a novel concept. So that was, I guess, kind of an embarrassing realization, but better that I realize that now than, once the game is close to completion. But, at the same time, that is quite the easy optimization right there, removing a ton of unnecessary, memory allocations whenever a dot header file gets included. So yeah, if you're gonna define like a global data structure like that and initialize it, don't do it in a header file that gets included everywhere. Because then you run into things like that. But the other thing I also got working on, which was kind of, I guess, more of the big focus this week, was getting the scroll feature working. And I had kind of waited up until this point to get it implemented because I wanted to get some other portions of the UI working. But the scroll feature in particular, so if you've ever played Pokemon before, you'll know when you scroll through, I guess really probably any game that has an inventory, really. When you scroll through your inventory, you notice it kind of like scrolls upward, like the text kind of just goes upward and like your selection arrow more or less stays in the same spot, like right in the middle, and the different elements kind of, scroll up or down depending on if you're going up or down in the inventory. So that was the kind of the big thing that I was trying to work on this week, kind of getting that functionality working. I had a basic general idea, some pseudocode implemented beforehand of how I kind of figured it might work. But of course, when I actually got around to testing it, it of course didn't work because nothing ever works on the first try. But the reason it took so long for me to do this was because I had to go through and manually enter a bunch of new items in order to fill up the inventory to have enough items for the scrolling to even occur, right? Because there's no sense in scrolling the menu if everything can fit within the window itself. So I had to essentially add a bunch of extra items in order to have enough items in order for the list to actually scroll in general. But I did get that working, and I also noticed a little bit, I guess it was kind of a bug. I don't know if it's my math that was wrong, or I'm just being dumb, or what, but when I was so a couple weeks ago, I talked about how I essentially kind of had a hacky solution to rotate images so they rotate properly and aren't way up out of the way, and essentially so you can put the coordinates you think the thing should actually be at, and also adding rotation, and it's actually where you expect it to be. So I was noticing, specifically with the navigational arrows to show you if you can move between the different bag pockets and scrolling up and down the list, I was noticing that even when my X and Y coordinates were the same, so in theory the arrows should be lined up perfectly, they were ever so slightly off. And maybe it's just I'm a perfectionist or something, but it was really aggravating me to see that they were ever so slightly off. If you just quickly glanced at it, it wouldn't necessarily be hugely noticeable. But if you looked at it a little bit closer, you could noticeably tell that they were not aligned properly. So I went back through and tried to figure out what the heck was going on. And I don't know if it's a rounding issue because things are floating point numbers or what the case ended up being. But I essentially, rather than adding by the full amount, the full width or the full height, I essentially added by a fraction of the width or the height, and that ended up to get things aligned properly. it's probably a super hacky solution, and there's probably a much better way of actually doing this, which I might run into later once I start having to rotate around other elements rather than just the navigational arrows specifically, but we shall see. But for the time being anyway, it's all working good. So yeah, that was kind of the nerdy things that I got up to this week. Now let's move into kind of the main topic of the episode, which is rewarding experiences for software developers. So this of course is a subjective list. This is by no means objective because the most rewarding experience for a developer is of course going to vary based on the developer. And of course, this is not a fully inclusive list because, of course, there's probably things that I'm neglecting to mention. But the first one I want to touch on is being the main developer for a project, or another way of kind of putting this, or a similar vein, kind of in the same vein of being the main developer, is being able to start a project from scratch. And the reason why I kind of put starting a project from scratch as a very rewarding experience is because if you've ever worked as a software developer professionally, it is very, very, very rare that you're going to be the one kind of pioneering a brand new project and starting from basically no code at all. Because more often than not, when you join, a company or whatever and get put on a software development project, you're most likely going to be either maintaining that code base or adding features to an existing code base. Very, very, very rarely do you ever get the opportunity to start from zero and build something from the ground up. So being in that position to start from zero and build from the ground up can definitely be a very, very rewarding experience. And kind of in the same vein is being the main developer on a big project, because I think for obvious reasons, if you're the lead or the primary developer on a project, you have a strong sense of ownership and pride over that code base and over that project as a whole. And as someone that has countless personal projects, literally countless because I often lose count with how many I have, being in control of the design and implementation of the project is a great feeling, especially if you're kind of the one calling the shots for, a team of developers. If you're kind of the go-to guy when it comes to how different features work, what code should be implemented, different features, all that kind of stuff. It can be a very, rewarding experience to be a part of that. So as a part of the team, if all the big decisions go through you, and you're like the prime developer that reviews and merges in code, like during merge requests, driving the future design of the project, and overall knowing the code base in and out, it is definitely a wonderful and powerful feeling. But for me personally, as rewarding as that can be, I don't necessarily think it, at least for me anyway, I don't necessarily think it is the most rewarding experience that a software developer can have. The next one I wanted to touch on is a software engineer liaison. And there's a couple, I guess, different ways that you could kind of phrase this, but essentially it's you're basically the middleman between the developers and the rest of the world. Because as a developer, I think I can speak for most when I say I don't enjoy having to interface with individuals that are not a part of my team. So whether that's customers, stakeholders, users, or whoever, I generally don't want to talk to other people, right? I want to focus on writing code and, maybe collaborating with my team every now and then when I have questions or they have questions or things like that. Since, at least in my experience, most developers don't really like these kinds of interactions. So if you can kind of serve as that middleman to essentially protect your developers, that can be a pretty rewarding experience, especially if you know the developers and know they don't like interacting with others, and kind of know You're essentially saving your team from the trouble of having to deal with someone else. It can be pretty rewarding in that sense, but personally, I also wouldn't necessarily consider this the most rewarding, at least for me, probably because I'm not necessarily a huge people person and kind of, in that vein of liking to interact with people. But if you are kind of more of a, outgoing person and you enjoy, communicating with customers, stakeholders, users, and just anyone that might want to interface with the development team and kind of being that middleman and, kind of protecting the developers behind you, that could definitely be a very rewarding experience for you if you are that type of person. The next one is kind of like a catch-all, basically anything involving learning something new. So, the feeling of pride that we as developers get when we learn a new skill, things like, learning a new programming language, a new framework, a new tool, and applying that to the real world can definitely be a very, rewarding experience, right? Because it's one thing to play around with a new programming language, maybe write a Hello World project and, some basic programs in the language, that's one thing. But if you can then apply that new programming language to a actual real world project that, whether that's something for personal use or in your professional life or whatever the case may be, being able to apply that new programming language or that new tool that you learned can be definitely a very rewarding experience. For example, if you, for instance, were, managing an IT infrastructure and you were doing everything through shell scripts and Python scripts, and then you happen to learn of this fancy schmancy new tool called Ansible that can essentially automate everything for you. You play around with it a little bit, you kind of learn the ins and outs of it, you write some basic playbooks, and then you take it into the workplace and you automate your workflow. It can be an incredibly rewarding experience to kind of see all of that play out. And to kind of touch on this a little bit, I guess I didn't touch on it in the nerdy things segment, but this week I finally got around to overhauling my guacamole instance. So I talked probably a couple months ago that I created an Ansible playbook to essentially spin up guacamole in Docker using Docker Compose. But I never actually switched over to using that in my production suite within my home lab. So today I ended up doing that, which honestly it was very quick to do because I already wrote the Ansible script for it and wrote Ansible scripts to clone virtual machines and initialize new virtual machines. So within 3 Ansible playbooks, probably in the span of 5 minutes, I got my new guacamole instance completely set up and running, strictly through Ansible, and it was amazing. And all of the time saved, doing that rather than having to go through the manual process of installing everything and configuring everything, just run the Ansible playbook and everything's good to go. So, it's experiences like this, where you learn new tools and technologies and apply them to real world scenarios that can really give you a sense of rewarding enjoyment out of it. And another thing I also enjoy too, and I think most people do in the tech sphere, is staying on top of the latest cutting edge technology. Whether that's you have GPUs in your computer or something, and you're playing around with like large language models or other AI models, or whatever the case may be. I think this is one of the reasons why many folks in the IT space have home labs, specifically for this reason of staying on top of the latest technology. Because one thing with industry, if you ever kind of get into being in the IT sphere in the industry tends to move slowly, not like a snail's pace, but they tend to be a little more hesitant, especially kind of the bigger companies. They're a little more hesitant to adopt, the bleeding edge, latest and greatest technologies, right? Like usually they'll find something that sticks and they'll kind of stick with it for a while before they transition to something else, right? Because if it ain't broke, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? But not having that kind of avenue to, explore technologies could be, detrimental and not be as rewarding. But if you can, play around with the latest technologies, whether that's in a home lab or in a lab environment at your workplace or something like that, and being able to apply that to the workplace can definitely be a very rewarding experience, especially as you, continue to grow and expand your skill set. It can be definitely a rewarding experience. But I'm not sure if I would even consider this the most rewarding, at least to me anyway. Kind of in a similar vein of, learning and stuff is being a subject matter expert. And this is kind of similar, I guess, to being the primary developer on a project, but in a more general sense. And what I mean by that is, for example, you might be the most skilled Python developer in your organization, but if your team, sparingly uses Python, whenever someone needs to use Python, they're going to come to you to use it, but you might not necessarily have projects specifically written in Python, if that makes sense. So subject matter experts, you're kind of, focused on a single subject, but it might not necessarily be focusing in on a singular project. It might, span, knowledge that would cover multiple projects potentially. Now, this can definitely be a rewarding experience knowing that you're a valued member of the team and kind of viewed as an expert. But there are some caveats here. And I think probably the biggest caveat is you're a SME or a subject matter expert compared to what? Because I've heard the term subject matter expert thrown around fairly kind of loosey-goosey at times, and it's like, okay, but what are you a subject matter expert compared to? Because if you don't have a sense of comparison, you calling someone a subject matter expert is worthless, right? It's like, we talked about in, a couple times on the podcast, like a while ago, the idea of when reviewers, like tech reviewers specifically, like review new products and they throw out like all these random benchmarks and compare it to like last year's device. Like, yeah, it's cool to see kind of the year over year improvement, but the device that I'm running that I'm thinking of upgrading from is like 5 years older than that. So that you're not really giving me, much to go on. I have no, sense of baseline. I don't know what the baseline is. So what are you really comparing to? Because you can throw around all kinds of benchmark numbers you want, but if you have no kind of base level that people can understand this, the magnitude of the increase in the benchmark, it's kind of worthless, at least in my opinion. So this idea of what are you a subject matter expert compared to? Like, what is the baseline that you are considering me a subject matter expert, from? Like, for example, an elementary schooler that's just learning their multiplication tables could be seen as a math subject matter expert compared to a room of preschoolers. But does that really make the elementary schooler a subject matter expert? Personally, I would argue no, but to the preschoolers, they might say otherwise because, again, it's all comparative, right? So compared to the preschoolers that haven't really started to learn math yet, seeing an elementary schooler, doing multiplication, it might be wizardry to them, and they're like, this math genius. But if you put the elementary schooler in a calculus class, they're going to have no idea what's going on. So again, what are you a subject matter expert compared to? And it's the same thing in the workplace because you'll often be deemed a subject matter expert just because you know more about a subject than most others on the team, even if you're not actually an expert in that at all. Most of the time, at least kind of in my experience, this is kind of, what it's been. Sometimes people be like, oh yeah, you're the subject matter expert on this. And it's like, well, I don't really know anything about this, but I guess I know more than you, so I guess that makes me the expert, right? So to me, it's been kind of this experience of you're like the elementary schooler in a room full of preschoolers in regards to math. Like, yes, you are technically speaking the expert in the room, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're the expert. Another caveat is if you are a subject matter expert, depending on what the subject is, you might get hounded very frequently to answer questions, and you might end up repeating yourself over and over again and having to answer the same questions, which could be tiresome. So, of course, there are some caveats there. Depending on where you fall, I guess, in the realm of being a subject matter expert, it can be a very rewarding experience knowing that people value your expertise and your insight. But again, there could be instances where you're just so above and beyond that you get constantly contacted about various questions, and at some point you kind of get sick of giving the same response over and over again. So I definitely see the importance to being a subject matter expert and how it can be rewarding, but at the same time it also can be kind of draining at the same time. The next one I want to touch on is recognition. And no, I'm not talking about it in the sense of getting a participation trophy. What I mean is developers are often always behind the scenes, right? Like when a new piece of software gets pushed out, or, a new feature comes out, the company that might be demoing or whatever loves to talk about the feature, but kind of the developers, do they get credit for it? I mean, they kind of say, we developed this, but, you don't necessarily get called out or anything. Now, of course, just because you develop something doesn't necessarily mean you should get all the praise in the world. Like I said, this isn't about getting a participation trophy, but developers often don't really necessarily get praise when a product works as expected, but when there's issues, they get an earful, right? They get tickets flooding in about, fixing all these bugs, and, the software doesn't work. It's always the developer's fault. You guys can't code. So there definitely can be, this kind of lack of recognition, I guess, and constant barrage of you stink, and oh, by the way, I needed this feature yesterday, can definitely cause burnout. But in a kind of an ironic twist, I guess, at least for me personally, both in my personal projects and professional experience, the most recognition I've gotten has been on projects that I never intended to make a big deal out of. And what I mean by this is they weren't, some big complex pieces of software or some ingenious algorithm design or some project that I was really proud of. Most of the quote unquote projects, if you will, were just like scripts or tools that I wrote to make my life easier, or because I was just lazy and wanted to simplify things. So if you remember back a couple months ago, I told a story about a guy who reached out to me on LinkedIn about my Xserve RAID admin Docker container tool. Do you guys remember that? So essentially, the point of that tool was meant for me to not have to run the Xserve RAID admin software on some ancient piece of machinery that had an old enough Java version in order to be able to run it anytime I wanted to play around with the Xserve RAID. So, and the reason, it's such a niche thing, right? Like this platform and tool have been dead for probably close to 2 decades at this point, and yet someone else still found it useful, and even though it was an extremely niche tool, which was kind of the thing that was kind of mind-boggling. It wasn't, the encryption algorithm I wrote. It wasn't the software I wrote to connect to and manage SSH connections. It wasn't any of the various projects that I'm more proud of. It was literally a tool that I wrote to make my life easier, so I don't have to constantly pull out an old ancient piece of machinery anytime I wanted to play with my ancient piece of machinery. But then the most recent occurrence was actually at work. Now, of course, I'm not going to go into specifics of this, but suffice it to say, about a year ago or so, I was tasked with migrating our Git repos from essentially one remote host to another one. And of course, me being the lazy son of a gun that I am, I wasn't about to do all that manually, so I wrote essentially a collection of Python scripts to handle all that for me, and then I also wrote another script to essentially sync the two remotes together while, the developers transition to using the new one. So fast forward, about a year or so ago, and these throwaway scripts, essentially, that I wrote just out of pure laziness, that I had no intention for them being used for anything else or anywhere aside from my singular use case, ended up saving one of my coworkers the misery of a similar, albeit different, use case. Now, let me tell you, the look on his face when it went from like complete dread to total elation when he realized this was already a quote-unquote solved problem, a little bit of a callback to last week's episode, and it was honestly a super rewarding experience in and of itself, just seeing, the elation on his face when he realized that he won't have to, go through a similar process, and he can make use of the script that already exists and save himself tons and tons of time and manual effort. But again, the funny thing about this was it's not even like this script was even the best written code that I ever written. It was literally kind of a hack job in order to make my life easier. And the reason I say it was a hack job was it was essentially a throwaway script for a reason. Like, it had one purpose to do one thing, and it was kind of hacked together, wasn't really robust at all, didn't, account for every single edge case, wasn't very robust, and just in general, I personally wouldn't really consider it shippable, if you will. And essentially, when I think of shippable software, I'm thinking software that has been, thoroughly and rigorously tested to ensure, to the best of everyone's knowledge, that there are no glaring, game-breaking bugs in it that can cause it to crash, things like that. It works like it's supposed to and has, like I said, been thoroughly tested and vetted. But again, this was a very niche type of script. It was a very niche use case. Where in both cases I wrote, in the Xserve RAID tool and these collections of scripts just to fit my use case, and in the case of these scripts, kind of the temporary solution kind of sort of became the permanent solution in a way. Because, like I said, it never really intended for it to be anything more than kind of a one-use type of a thing. So again, in my experience, the recognitions that I've kind of experienced have been from more niche scenarios and borderline useless tools that, you wouldn't think would actually get noticed, but they, of course, tend to be the ones that get noticed, which, in kind of an ironic twist, this actually makes complete sense if you think about it. Because if you think about it, if you're trying to search for solutions to a problem online, if you search high and low and you find absolutely nothing, and you're searching for hours and hours, you find nothing, and then all of a sudden you happen to cross a small blog post, a GitHub repo, a YouTube tutorial, or something like that basically has no views, no interaction, no comments, no stars, no forks, no nothing, and basically no recognition at all, yet it does exactly what you're looking for. That's kind of like a diamond in a rough scenario where you kind of attach more value to this thing because it solved the very niche use case that you were searching for, rather than kind of the dime a dozen type of a scenario. Like, oh yeah, you want a password manager? Yeah, pick from a list of any of these. Oh yeah, you want to figure out how to implement X, Y, and Z algorithm? Yeah, follow any one of these tutorials. Like, a lot of the time, if you're kind of implementing something that's very common, you kind of get lost in the shuffle, right? Like, it's a lot harder to break through, I guess, in a way, when you're kind of going with the masses and creating something that a bunch of those things already exist. But if you create something that's very niche, in a way, it's hard to get noticed because not many people are going to look for it. But the few people that do look for it are going to happen across what you did, and they're going to be very thankful for it, specifically if it's a very niche and complex thing that you happen to create a solution for. So personally, I think I find that to be kind of very rewarding, especially when it's something that it comes where you least expect. Like I'm pretty sure there's a quote out there, or maybe several, about things coming and being found when you least expect it, and that's kind of exactly what I was referring to and referencing in this kind of segment here. With very niche and projects that you sometimes you might think are kind of useless, that you just happen to be a one-use thing, but someone else might happen to also be in that same situation, and they're going to find great value in the fact that you already solved their problem for them, and they might be a little more willing to thank you for your troubles rather than coming across a Git repo that has like 200 stars and a couple hundred forks or something, and is a very well-known and established project that solves whatever they're trying to do. And then I guess the last one I kind of wanted to touch on here is being a mentor. Now, mentoring new developers is essentially an unavoidable fact of being a software engineer. Especially if you've been around for a while, since if you've been around for a while, you will eventually have to mentor new guys, even if that's indirectly. Now, some developers can't stand this and they just want to code all day, which I totally understand, especially if you're constantly having to, take time out of your day to, go mentor someone and you have deadlines you need to meet. It can be a little frustrating, and you do just kind of want to set some time aside and just write some code. Constantly having to walk a new developer through things or handhold them as they kind of get up to speed can definitely take a hit to your productivity. But when it comes to mentoring and teaching, this can, of course, come in multiple different forms. And I think, one of them being that mentoring, where it's clear that the person you're mentoring doesn't care to learn at all, isn't beneficial for any party, right? Like if you're tasked with mentoring a new developer, say bringing them up to speed on the code base, but it's very clear and evident that they have absolutely no intention of learning the code base or caring at all, you're wasting your time because they don't care, and they're essentially wasting your time because you're trying to help them, but they're like, I don't care, and they have no intention to learn it. But on the other hand, if it is clear that the person wants to learn and is eager to work with and soak up all that knowledge, like my server rack that's eager to add a new server when there's an empty slot, that can be a very rewarding experience for both parties. So, one of the reasons I started this podcast was in the hopes that kind of my thoughts, experience, and ideas might be able to help or inspire others to get into software development, home labbing, or even cybersecurity. Now, I've often said one of the ways I've gotten inspiration to set up something in my home lab or work on a specific personal project was I was inspired to do so by hearing about someone else's project. And like I said, that was one of the reasons why I kind of wanted to start this podcast, was in the hopes that I could essentially be that avenue for someone else. I didn't make the podcast because I thought I know everything and believe people should listen to me because I know everything and listen to what I have to say, because quite honestly, if that were the case, I'd be one of the least credible podcasters out there, because just look back at all the failures and shortcomings and sometimes incompetencies that I've displayed over the course of talking with you all over the past few years through the various nerdy segments we've had. Very frequently, I will talk about, literally just today, some of the failures and shortcomings I had in my Pokemon project, allocating way more memory than I need to because I was declaring essentially a data structure that was getting recreated every time the header file was included, right? Rookie mistake, should never have done it, definitely a blunder on my end. So I, of course, am not immune to making mistakes, and nobody is. But kind of on that topic, if you've listened to the podcast for long enough, kind of as I just stated, I frequently talk about, sometimes ad nauseum in fact, about all the various mistakes and shortcomings and failures that I've made either during the course of a software development project or a home labbing project. Because, as I like to say, I am a code monkey who occasionally breaks stuff in his home lab. And I wouldn't occasionally break stuff in my home lab if I was perfect and didn't have, make any failures, mistakes, or have any kinds of shortcomings. But as I've stated before, the reason I bring up these failures is to give you a glimpse into what things are really like. I don't want to sugarcoat things and just show how pretty the final product is, right? Because imagine you were trying to design a car, like you were a car designer, and you just showed, the car off and kind of as the final product. It might look awesome, and it probably is, but if all you do is talk about the design, the style, how fast the car goes, and neglect to mention all the hours of engineering, the math, the physics, the wind tunnel testing, all of the stuff that goes into designing a car, like all the down and dirty stuff that goes into designing a car, and you just show off the glitz and glamour, you're kind of giving folks the wrong impression of really goes into what designing a car really entails. So kind of, going back to software development and home labbing, yeah, the final product is very awesome. I 100% agree with that. But there's a lot of bumps in the road along the way that you have to overcome in order to get to that. Because basically anything in IT, at least for me, and I'm sure many of you that have been doing either software development or home labbing or anything IT related for a while, if something works on the first try, you are suspect. You don't believe it because things never work on the first try. There's always something that goes wrong, because even in cases where things look like they worked on the first try, more often than not, there's something behind the scenes that didn't actually work, whether it was a silent failure or something else, that means it didn't actually work like it was supposed to, because things rarely work on the first try. Your code might compile on the first try, but does it actually do what it's supposed to on the first try? Maybe not. So a large part of the learning process is failing and learning why you failed so you can then do better the next time in order to not make the same mistake. Which is another reason why I so frequently bring up my failures on the podcast, is to allow you to vicariously live through my mistakes. So if you ever encounter them in your own personal projects or professional endeavors, you already kind of have that background knowledge and you can avoid some of those mistakes that I already ran into. So for instance, maybe you are tasked with designing some kind of global data structure in a C++ project, and now you have the knowledge that no, you shouldn't define everything in the header file. You should externally define it in a CPP file so it doesn't get recreated and hog up a bunch of memory every time your header file gets included. So just an example off the top of my head. Now that was kind of a tangent, but to weave this back into mentoring, I had the pleasure to mentor some of my coworkers this week on Git. Now, remember that whole kind of subject matter expert debate that we had a few moments ago? That's essentially what this mentoring session was, if you will, because I am by no means a Git expert by any stretch of the imagination. Now, in fairness, I have done my fair share of funkiness with Git, probably the most notable of which was there was a couple of occasions where I took two branches with diverging Git histories and through a combination of cherry picking and rebasing got them all to merge back together and back into master and work together. So that was probably the most notable funkiness I've done with Git. But I still would by no means consider myself an expert on Git by any means, because mainly, now granted, the majority of stuff that I use Git for I can do without really any issue. But like that example I gave before, taking a divergent branches that, have divergent Git history is kind of a death sentence, sort of. Some developer strategies in those kinds of scenarios is just to nuke the branch and start over from scratch. But I could definitely do that again, but it's not something that I could just rattle off on the command line in one go and be done with it, right? Like I'd have to go through and look up some documentation and figure out the specific flags I'd need to use in order to do it properly. But I would know kind of the things that I would need to search for in order to accomplish that. Now, in my opinion, if I were a Git expert, I would be able to just kind of rattle off that command from the command line without having to look anything up. But kind of tangent aside, I kind of getting back to this kind of mentoring session. Like I said, I kind of know enough to do what I need to do on a regular basis, and kind of have this general idea. If I know what I want to do with Git, I know what to look for in order to get the commands and the flags that I need to accomplish what I want to do. But not all my coworkers are as knowledgeable of Git as I am. So the irony here is, while they thought they were burdening me with questions and, having me help them out and kind of doing a little hand-holding and walking them through stuff at times, for me, nothing could have been further from the truth. Because let me tell you, those last few minutes of the workday when I was helping them through Git honestly were some of the fastest minutes of the entire day. Not to mention the feeling of purpose that I had, because for me, there is very little that like one of the things that kind of motivates me is being able to help others and kind of giving and kind of having that sense of purpose that I'm providing something and someone is getting benefit out of it, right? So kind of moving back into a more general context, as being a mentor, as a developer, if you're a developer and all you do is just clock in, crank out some code and clock out, it's very easy to kind of lose your sense of purpose and kind of the feeling of what you're doing. Does this actually even matter? Like if all you do is you clock in, crank out code for, a few hour chunks at a time, and then you clock out, it can be very easy to kind of lose a sense of purpose and kind of get this feeling that, does any of the code I'm writing even matter? Does the tool I'm working on actually serve a purpose? Now, maybe it's just how I'm wired, but there's something about, helping others and sharing, albeit sometimes the little knowledge that I have on some subject to help them, is often more rewarding to me than days or even weeks of solid progress in actual code implementation. Like, for me, like if I have the opportunity to help someone and I know, and I can see that I'm, providing a noticeable, measurable impact to that person's, well-being, their productivity, whatever the case may be, and I can see the benefit that I'm providing with, the help I'm giving, that is honestly a much more rewarding experience than, oh yeah, I just, closed out, 5 tickets this week and, knocked out like 20 story points this sprint or something like that. Being able to, help someone is for me, it's more rewarding. But again, maybe that's just how I'm wired. But yeah, so those I think are some of the main kind of rewarding experience that I kind of thought of that I think most developers, would be likely to, latch on to as being the most rewarding experience that a software developer could have. But I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are. If you're a software developer, I'd be interested to hear if any of these are you would consider to be your most rewarding experience. If you have one that I didn't mention, I'd also be interested to hear that. If you're on YouTube, you can leave a comment down below. Otherwise, you can shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. And if there's some good ones, I will definitely be sure to include those in a future episode, and we might be able to revisit this with some other rewarding experiences and some of your feedback as well. But before we go for today, let us wrap up with our trivia question for the week. So aside from version control, what do Team Foundation Server, or TFS, Mercurial, and Git have in common? If you said they all came out in 2005, that at least is the answer that I was looking for. Now, if you said something else, there is a potential chance that you might also be correct. But if you said that they all came out in 2005, then you are correct. You read my mind. You got the answer I was looking for. So congratulations. And if you enjoyed this episode, definitely be sure to leave it a rating and review and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And be sure to share with a friend or family member. And if you have any questions about this episode or have any comments, topics, or ideas for future episodes, either leave a comment down below if you're on YouTube or shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. The link for that is down in the show notes below. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.